Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 63rd episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, did you know that I've actually been working for LSS this whole time? And every time I just think about something that's a good idea, I've actually been implementing it in the back end, this whole time anyways.
That's pretty impressive that you kept that from me. I feel like I know your life pretty well. You're a busy guy. You got a lot going on. You got your kid, you got your job, you got podcasts, and you hang out with me a lot. So I don't know where you found time to work for LSS, but I'm impressed.
Yeah, I just implemented the dual class cards. That was a great idea. And then I'm glad we discussed, doing something extra with like a booster pack slot, because it didn't have to be predefined. You could have like a whole extra slot that you don't even have to need for limited, that you could put like supplemental cards in. So, you're welcome for putting that idea in. A mono class set, only one set for focusing on limited to make sure that you have more meaningful decisions in limited play. You're welcome on that one. And then finally, last but not least, a jumpstart like product where you can just pick up, throw a couple booster packs together and play games with your friend. We said how much we like, that experience with the jumpstart stuff, over there, right there. And I decided why not put it in Flesh and Blood too. So you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really looking forward to the new set. I think it's going to be sick. I think your ideas are really going to shine through and make the set a great one.
Oh boy. I'm sure it's a. Go ahead.
I was going to say I am really excited for the new set. I don't know, like supplemental sets just don't do it for me. But they announced this set with limited in it. And I'm like, I'm in. I don't play mech. I think Dash is I don't want to offend anybody, but Dash is the hero I am least interested in of all like the 15 class constructed heroes. I think they all do something more interesting than Dash does. And they're definitely not all better than Dash. I put Dash in A tier. I think Dash is quite good, but definitely a lot more interesting. She has boosts and she got items, and neither that's that interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, first off, your tier list is sus at this point. I think at this point, your hero evaluations were a little bit off. Maybe should have been more on par with my evaluations, putting Bravo, right below Lexi at the top of A tier, and then putting, the wizards in that A tier, B tier range, just more things. But but to be fair, I know all this stuff way ahead of you since I work for LSS. I've tested this meta way ahead of time. I knew how the interplay was going to work out between these heroes, so I don't blame you.
Yeah, I think we both kind of messed up because clearly the only thing that matters in a tournament is winning. And Icelander is the only one that's won an event. So it's really like S tier is Icelander, then nobody's in A tier because nobody else is winning anything. And then B tier, everybody else is there,
Yeah, I mean, that's how Living Legend points work. So
no, but yeah, Icelander won three tournaments in a row. That's pretty good for putting her in C tier. Who would do that?
Yeah. So Bright Lights was announced. Do you want to spend anything you want to talk about Bright Lights overall before we get to the main topic of the cast?
Oh gosh. So
did you kind of touch on it already with the mechanologist thing?
Yeah, I think I actually have a lot to say about Bright Lights. I am, first off, very excited that it seems like a set that they put a lot of thought into the sealed format, which I love sealed. You love sealed. Sealed's great. Designing
that's why I designed it this way. You're welcome.
Designing a product around just having a very interesting sealed format. It's very different. They're experimenting with only 4 packs for your sealed pool. There's only one hero, so you're just making choices about which cards you're cutting, if these cards pull you into playing this versus this other mechanologist, because they're all mechanologists. But I expect the sealed format to be very good. I think that this set feels like a set designed to have a very good sealed format, and I'm honestly this might be pretty bad to say, but I've been considering not going to Worlds. Just kind of talked about burnout before, and I really don't like traveling. I like my house. I like being home, and Worlds is real far away. But the fact that there is a really cool sealed calling for this set that seems built to have a good sealed format, that's definitely encouraging me to want to go, because I'm really excited to dive into sealed of this new set.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun.
Go ahead. Do you have anything else to say about it?
I'm still not going because law school. So I hope you have fun in Barcelona. But
Yeah. So there's also the jumpstart thing. I expect it's not going to be competitive. Jumpstart's the Magic format where you mix and shuffle packs together. I think this is a great casual format. I don't know. We've played it a lot in Magic, and it's cool that because set this set is one class only, you can do that without having to do weird rules. You can just like all your cards are going to work together. They're all going to be met cards, and it'll be I don't know. It'll be good. I expect that if we're going to play limited to this format, we'll probably just do sealeds because it will take a little bit longer, but I think sealed's more fun than jumpstart usually. But I think it's great that this is an
yeah,
option.
well, it's 4 pack sealed, right? So I mean, yeah. I don't know how much I'll love the set flavor wise personally. Um, I so with the world of Wraith, it's very much high fantasy themed. We just came off with like these angels and demons fighting this epic war, and then it's like, yeah, then there's a mech over there, and then here's Tony Stark, and it's like I'm for steampunk like kind of things. I like the steampunk s kind of thing, but I feel like they pushed the notch closer to the edge of Kaladesh as opposed to like I don't know traditional steampunk kind of like vibes. But that's very personal. That's very nitpicky. That's a you know just a taste kind of a deal. Uh, as far as like the actual execution of the set, who knows? It's going to be, probably really sweet. Hopefully,
I have very very high hopes. Um,
well, hopefully there's not too much variance in your hopes, though.
uh, yeah, I don't know.
Unless you have anything
Couple
else to
other.
say about, I'll go for it.
There are some spoiler cards. It's really hard to say a lot about them. The new hero looks cool. I'm glad it's something more interesting than you start with X thing and play Teklo, whatever his name is, the new guy, the
Cheklospin.
new Tony Stark looking guy. Yeah, Teklo. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about Icelander a little bit before we jump into variants?
I mean, I thought Iceland was part of the variance. Spoiler: that's the main topic of the
Oh,
episode is variance. Because
well, it's in the title.
you don't know what the title is. I don't even know what the title is.
It's gonna
I,
it's gonna have something to do with the main topic.
we record the episode and I think of a clever, funny, encapsulating title afterwards.
And it's not gonna include
Nope, not
variants.
not anymore now, buddy. There's going to be no.
That's some
Yeah,
rough
that's
beats. I got the bad end of
yeah,
variants
that's a pretty
there.
high variance line you took there. So there was a conversation recently that Brian had where he thinks the game is a little bit too low variance, and that we see people like Michael Hamilton winning worlds and then a calling and doing well at all these events consistently, and Brody Spurlock winning and doing well consistently. Michael Fung, the all-star names we've been seeing win event to event. Rhea now, I guess we can throw her name up there. Winning back-to-back Battle Hardens is no small feat in and of itself either, and basically there's a conversation to be had. Is Flesh and Blood too low variance? And if you were to increase the variance, what are the different types of variance that can exist inside of a game? Like I think there's very healthy variance that can exist if you want to dial it up, and I think there's very toxic, unfun, unhealthy variance that can be pretty easily slotted in as well. And I think there is already some toxic variants already not prevalent, but in Flesh and Blood overall. But anything you want to riff off of what I just said there?
You said a lot. It's hard to kind of talk about one point. I think like the point that in my opinion, the best players winning or people winning a lot that are doing well. I am very biased, but I think that is a big part of what drew me to Flesh and Blood is I know in Magic the amount of games that I lost to not drawing my third land, keeping a 2-lander and dying to not drawing a third land, or mulliganing to 5 and then dying because you're on 5 cards, you die. I think they've made improvements to the mulligan system since I have more strong memories of mulliganing to 5 and dying, but still was a big part of the game that I remember is mulliganing and then losing because you're just down 2 cards. Magic's variance has a lot of bad parts to it, but it also a lot of good parts about like playing to your outs, trying to draw certain things, playing to your out of your opponent drawing badly and giving you an opportunity to get back in. I feel like it has some spots that feel pretty bad. I think just dying to lands is pretty bad. I think that variance inherently, I don't like designing to increase variance. I think like it's a card game. It's going to have a lot of variance in it. You're going to draw your cards in a random order. Sometimes you'll draw all red. Sometimes you'll draw all blue. Sometimes you'll draw a good mix of non-attacks and attacks to create your embodiment of lightning and attack with Rosetta Thorn and do a bunch of above rate things. Um, and I think that feels like a much more healthy version of variance than kind of like designing these cards that are like intrinsically just high variance. Cards like uh, Bolton's new 2 or 1 cost pump, the
Bologna.
Prayer of Bologna, Prayer of Bologna, where it's like if you flip a yellow off the top, it's the best card in the deck. Well, that might not be true. It's a very, very good card. And if you miss, then you're paying 1 resource and a card for +2, which is a horrible rate. Um, Cards like Sonata Arcanics, I also don't like, where you're just like flipping cards off the top of your deck. Though Sonata, it does encourage interesting deck building decisions where you're trying to like build your deck to have an even split of attack actions and non-attack actions, and it makes like every time you include a card that's not an attack action or a non-attack action, it adds a cost to that and like makes your Sonatas weaker by putting like Sink Belows or Lightning Presses in your deck. So at least, and Prayer Bologna, you want to be a yellow heavy deck. So at least, and you maybe want cards that give you ways to look at the top part of your deck. So at least like these forms of variance are they have like deck building decisions that make the cards better or weaker, and there's not really a good way to do that without including some variance in them. I think cards like Scabskin Leathers and Crazy Brew. I know Crazy Brew is not a competitive level card, but just that effect where you roll a die and you get either a very powerful game breaking effect or sometimes just like horrible downside of like you lose your turn in the case of rolling a 1 with Scabskin's Leathers, or a Crazy Brew of rolling a 1. I think you spend a card and an action point
You
and you
lose 2
get
life.
a net
Yeah.
loss of life or something. So I I don't like that kind of variance. I think that feels just really, really bad when you roll horribly. And even if it's designed and balanced in a way that the EV is the expected value of the card is fine. I think the games that you win by rolling all 4s through 6s on Scabskins, they your opponent just feels horrible. They don't feel like they had much agency in the game. They feel like they just lost because you rolled well. Same thing with playing against KO. I think that hero is definitely aimed at being a casual hero, but if the hero was ever constructed level for or blitz viable, I think that's like pretty horrible because your games are just going to be decided whether you roll 5s and 6s on your attacks and just get cards that are at twice the rate that they should be, or a bunch of 1s through 4s where you don't get any value after that. And I think I really don't like that kind of design.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with you there. I think the dice rolling is like the worst part of Flesh and Blood that currently exists, aside from, I guess it's like dice rolling 1, random discard 2, and they haven't done a random discard effect since Tales of Aria. I wonder why. But yeah, just that's just very unhealthy elements of variance that can exist within a game. But there was something kind of baked into what we just said here. I guess Brute then is inherently a high variance class because they are randomly discarding their own cards still. Like that's still a thing that happens. I guess we saw randomly banishing now with Levia technically, but same difference. And dice rolling is still core as long as Scabskin Leathers are going to be around, which I don't see them printing legs better than Scabskin Leathers anytime soon. So what do you think are low variance heroes? Like, would you say Icelander has to be a low variance hero in order to to win 3 events in a row this consistently?
So no, that has nothing to do with like winning 3 events in a row doesn't really have to do with consistency. Like on top of like your deck, like the inconsistencies in your deck, there's also a lot of variance in matchups. You can just like hit bad matchups and lose a tournament. It's not because like I think like your win rate as a hero and like a hero's win rate and their how low variance they are not really related. And to win 3 tournaments in a row, you just have to have a hero that's going to have a good win rate against whatever you run into, basically. I do think Icelander is one of the lower variance heroes in the game, but I don't think that's why she's done so well. I think it's why a lot of good players are drawn to her. Um, because like a lot of your power cards being blue means that your deck is just less likely to have an issue where you just don't draw blues, or the deck is like 40 blues and 20 reds or something around that. Maybe you get your 3 yellow Aether Ice Veins, but it's predominantly blues. You can still just lose to drawing 4 reds in a hand and not really being able to use your hand efficiently. That's part of why Scar for Scar and E-Strike were so good, is they're reds that are still good if you draw a bunch of other reds. Yeah, I guess compared to other decks, Icelander's not really looking to draw certain cards and combinations. She's trying to draw like Aether Ice Vein plus a blue plus an ice card. Not a very specific combination. She's trying to draw Channel like Frigid and blue ice cards, which the deck is a bunch of blue ice cards. Not a very specific combination. So overall, I would say that she is one of the lower variants. But I think the hero that I look at or think of when I think of lowest variants is Oldheim.
Yeah, agreed. We saw that play, over the entire time he was legal in class constructed. He was a staple and favorite among, tournament players from start to finish because of that lower variance. When you are a player with like a skill gap across your opponent, you are looking to make the game go longer and decrease variance because that maximizes your chances of winning. Because if you're making better decisions than your opponent on turn to turn basis, then that's going to allow you to win more games overall in the tournament. And that's why we saw, Michael Fung win the Pro Tour on Oldhim by just playing these insanely long, grindy games of Oldhim where he just on, and people would say things like, yeah, well, the Drome I could have won if they just remembrance perfectly on turn 6 or something like that. But it's like, okay, like the amount of foresight and the amount of everybody's going to make some number of mistakes in Flesh and Blood in a game. Like that's just going to happen. The game's incredibly hard. There's too many variables to think about across the entire game in order to play perfectly and never make a mistake in an entire game of Flesh and Blood. But when you just make one less mistake than your opponent, like if your opponent makes 2 mistakes across like a 2-hour game and you only make one mistake, you still made less mistakes than your opponent, and that could be the difference in the game. And I think we saw that consistently play out time and time again with Oldheim's matchups where, he was playing like ridiculous number, like 40 plus blues in some of his builds, he was able to block incredibly well, mitigate a lot of damage through Crown of Seeds and his own hero ability through the Earth React as well. Be very disruptive with his Ice effects or the Guardian attacks, and just be able to be incredibly consistent in executing that game plan. Because if you think about it, like I don't even know what like a high variant, like the worst thing that could happen to Oldheim, like you said, it's the worst thing that can happen to Iceland, like you said, where he draws an all red hand. But even then, he's just like, oh, okay, I'll block 3 cards, arsenal my last card. Like you still get like a perfectly fine exchange out of that because the deck blocks so well, and he's not always looking to be pressuring his opponent in very specific ways like Icelander is. So I definitely agree that Oldheim is like the lowest variance here on Flesh and Blood. And that's kind of what I was looking for in Bravo now, and what we're kind of seeing these new builds of Bravo do, where they're executing a very similar game plan, really trimming down on, I think Bravo's playing close to 40 blues now, something like that. Maybe not quite because of the yellows from Starstruck, but right around that area, and Starstruck still is a perfectly fine resource card on a lot of turns. And once again, the worst thing that happens to Bravo is he draws an all red hand, but he can still just block perfectly acceptably still. He just doesn't get as much free damage mitigation, obviously not having access to the Earth React or Crown of Seeds, but he can still have, a lot of blocking armor available to him. He can still play Titan's Fist in a shield, and we can see him try to play out those lower variance games across his opponent. He doesn't have to always be trying to, dominate and push and hope that he just draws this perfect ratio of blues in his one dominate attack anymore, because that was kind of his game plan before, but that is just not the case anymore.
Yeah, I would say Bravo is still reasonably higher variance than Oldheim. I think like part of what helped Oldheim be so low variance is when he drew a hand of all blues. Um, and sometimes like a lot of the blues are not blues you want to play. Like the blue eights are okay to play if you're stuck with 4 cards, but um, it's not really what you're wanting to do. One thing Oldheim had going for him was he had Crown of Seeds, and you could arsenal whatever random blue, and eventually you'd have an extra resource on a turn, or you'd have a tunic counter, and you could use Crown of Seeds to just put that blue on the bottom and not have to basically play this blue below rate card out of your arsenal. You instead just get to use Crown of Seeds and play at rate for a larger portion of your hands, basically. Um, Bravo not having that does mean that there's slightly higher risk with having such a high blue count where you don't want to play a lot of your blues as Bravo, especially like past the first turn of the game. I think the first turn you get like Imposing Visage and Showtime that are great to play, but later in the game you don't really want to play those cards. They're not cards that you'd want to arsenal. They're not cards you'd want to play. And without Crown of Seeds, you can't really arsenal random blues willy nilly and play them out. So Rouse and Terra Sunder are still both extremely good, especially in combination with Anathos. But the other blues are all kind of not really what you're looking for. So
Yeah, absolutely. And even sometimes even arsenaling reds can be awkward where you're just not drawing the right opportunities in order to like present your spinal crush or crippling crush or things like that. Like you still, whether you're even in circumstances where you're looking to play that card, having the game state and resources line up where you're then able to execute on that doesn't always line up perfectly either. So yeah, I definitely do agree that Bravo still has more variance overall than Oldheim, but at the end of the day, he's still a Guardian, and I don't think he's like an inherently like super high variance hero.
yeah, I'd agree.
So what do you think? Or is like a good kind of variance then? Like, so like, what do you think is like the best like card with variance in Flesh and Blood in your opinion?
So we talked about Prayer of Bologna and Sonata, which I think are like kind of like not the best, but like at least there's like deck building decisions you make around them to try to make them better. And you have to like make decisions around um, how many copies of each thing you're going to do. Ravenous Rabble shares that similar thing where you're like, a lot of decks want red Ravenous Rabble, but a lot of these decks are not going to play 60 reds. They're going to play some number of blues, and Ravenous Rabble is a reasonably high variance card based, and it impacts deck building decisions. So I think like these kind of cards are solid, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with including them in your game because, again, deck building things. So I think the best form of variance, though, that's a tough question. I'll have to think about that for a second.
Okay, I'll give my answer, and then you can hopefully it helps inform your decision. Because my answer is Rebel and Runeblood, where basically when you are able to execute and do Revel in Runeblood's effect of creating those 4 rune chants, and especially in Viserai where you're getting that extra 5th rune chant, it's an incredibly powerful card, one of the most powerful cards in the game. When you are not doing, like when you can't play the attack and non-attack action, it's a red non-attack action 2 block. So it's very, very, very bad when you're not doing its thing. So that's a pretty wide chasm between its ceiling and its floor. So there's a lot of variance there. But I think that's kind of the direction you should go in a card, to have variance where you are the one controlling like the ultimate destiny of the card. You can choose to arsenal it if you want to have just a mopey 2 block. You're using it below rate. You're still getting something out of it. You're not excited about it. You can still pitch it. You're not happy to pitch reds, but like it still has a functional floor, even if it's not great. While still having an incredibly high ceiling. That's the kind of effect I really like. And I guess what spurred this conversation, additionally, not only was the conversation around variance, but obviously Warmonger's recital has been the talk of the past 3 tournaments. With
Warmonger's Diplomacy.
Warmonger's Diplomacy has been the talk of the past 3 tournaments, where it's just hosing entire classes. And I think Warmonger's Diplomacy is a bad kind of variance for Flesh and Blood overall, because its ceiling is your opponent doesn't get to play the game for a turn cycle. which is not an ideal ceiling for what you want your cards to be doing. And its floor is it does literal nothing, where your opponent's just like, I choose war, I'm attacking you with Ravenous Rabble, E Strike, Command and Conquer anyways, this turn, idiot. What you did? You just spent a whole card and an action point doing actual nothing because I was able to play around your card this turn. So that's, like I was saying with Revel and Runeblood, a wide chasm between when it's doing its thing and it's not. I guess its floor, it's technically still, it might be a little bit better in that it's a blue 3 block, but the actual effects that it has in games when cast, I think, is not a great direction to be taking the game in for increasing variance.
Yeah, I guess I kind of compare it to Red Arctic Incarceration, where like sometimes, depending on the context of your opponent's hand, it's going to take them off doing anything. Red Arctic, at least it always trades for a card where they have to pitch an extra blue to play the game. Whereas Warmonger, sometimes they just like don't want to do something. You look at an Azalea with a non-attack action in her arsenal, and you cast Warmonger's Diplomacy. There's basically nothing she can do to have a functional turn. She can choose peace and play the non-attack action, but like she doesn't have any permanent she can play. I guess she can play. Sorry, if she has the attack actions in hand, like Command and Conquer, E Strike, Ravenous Rabble, then she can play those. But it is a very high variance card, and I think that my biggest issue, more than it being a high variance card too, is just that like the ceiling is so high, and the ceiling being essentially like your opponent doesn't get to do anything on their turn in the right matchups in the right spots.
It's a punishing ceiling as opposed to a proactive ceiling.
Yeah, and then also I don't like such powerful cards being printed at blue block 3s. I think that's my biggest problem with it. If it was a red block 2, then not as many decks would slot it in. I think it would still be a card that you would be happy if you had it in against Azalea, against Lexi, against Viscerai for sure. But it being a blue block 3 means you can just always include it. There's no cost to not wanting to play it. It's a blue. It's going to pitch for 3 resources. That's as much as any card can pitch for. And it'll block for 3. That's as much as any cards, barring narrow defense reactions, can block for. So it does. If you're in a spot where you don't need it, you don't need to hope to kind of blow out your opponent with it. You can just block with it. And it's not going to take up sideboard slots. You can just mainboard it in a lot of decks because it's a blue block 3. Whereas you talked about Revel and Runeblood. I really like Revel and Runeblood for similar reasons to what you said. But the fact that it's a red 2 block means like if you're including this in your deck, there's going to be times that you draw it where it is not great to play it. Maybe it's the end of the game. You're both at 2 life. You're not going to be able to play a non-attack, an attack, Revel and Runeblood, and also attack with something else to pop those rune chants. It asks a lot, and in exchange, it gives you a very good card. A 0-for-4 non-attack action is not really. I don't think there's a lot of cards that are 0-for-4 non-attack actions, especially like
especially dealing arcane damage in the way it does.
Yeah, so I do think Warmongers is not great design, but I think that's more. I feel like this one's more on the back of it just being a blue block 3 than because it's high variance. I think if it's a red block 2, that fixes my problems with it. It's still a high variance card, but there's a big cost including it in your deck. And there's going to be spots where it's bad, and you put it in a red 2 block, that's going to have spots where it's bad.
You know what is also a little bit more of a higher variance card overall, but kind of fills a similar void in this like disrupting your opponent game plan, which also just came out in Dust Till Dawn, Lost in Thought. I think Lost in Thought is a beautifully designed card overall, and I think its power level is quite high, as we've seen the past few weeks. It's still a high variance card because sometimes your opponent just doesn't, you won't be able to do very much. Your opponent has the redundant popper. Like, its ceiling isn't always as insane as like just taking any card. It has the downside of giving your opponent the ponder token if they are able to use their hand effectively after you try to disrupt them with this. Like, it has very clear like downsides built into it, but its upside, as we saw in the Mara Ferris versus Pat Eggsy, Drum Ivy Levia game, where Mara was able to just make Pat unable to take a game action on his turn, but that was because of the interaction and the timing and the way that she kind of maneuvered that game state and was able to make the right decisions in order to get the card to have that level of a ceiling, where instead of just playing it and being like choose. Um, And ultimately, there's going to be points where, much like Thoughtseize, people will take the wrong card with Lost in Thought. Like it's not a lot of the time it'll be trivial, like, yeah, take the popper or yeah, take the blue. But there are going to be edge cases where it's like, well, I don't know. Should I have taken the Command and Conquer or should I have taken the Enlightened Strike? Like, because like if they have Pummel in Arsenal, then it was much better to take the Command and Conquer. But if they have a Scar for a Scar, then I'd like, there's going to be decisions like that. Um, so I almost would have rather just Lost in Thought been a generic card because once again, it's a red 2 block that has a disruptive effect that's very good into a bunch of different decks. But I don't know about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think so. We've seen Wizard and Illusionist so far that have had disruption for your opponent's hand. I can't remember the name of the Wizard card. So
Brain Freeze,
oh sure,
Pry.
Brain Freeze, Pry. Yeah, Brain Freeze definitely. I forgot about that one. I was thinking of Pry. I forgot Brain Freeze exists. So like, I don't think it doesn't feel like it's locked to a specific class now that Wizards and Illusionists have it. So I think it could be a generic. I like that it's a red. I like that it's a 2 block, and you're net exchanging down on resources where you're spending a card and a resource to take a card from them and also give them a ponder token. So on rate, it is quite bad, but it's a high variance card where sometimes you take their attack and their turn doesn't work. You either take the only blue they had, or you take the only attack they had, or you take their popper and you get attacked with a bunch of phantasm stuff. And that is a very high variance thing where sometimes you're going to take a card from their hand that was worth like 3 or 4 points of value, and they're going to play a full turn, draw a card off the ponder token, and you spent a card and a resource to take away 3 or 4 damage, and they get a card back. So that if that card's worth 3, you spend a card and a resource for like 0 to 1 points of value, which is quite bad. And that on a red 2 block, there's a lot of situations where it can go wrong, and that just definitely feels like better or design that I am a fan of.
Yeah. If we move away from like red 2 block like designs of variance cards, do you think Art of War's a high variance card? Or do you think like I guess one level higher than that? What do you think about like yellow no blocks, or like kind of like what's like a sliding scale that you think these cards should be have like as like their floor then?
Yeah, if you look at the yellow no blocks that see a lot of play, you think of Art of War, you think of Rain Razors. I think those are the only two.
Remembrance,
What'd you say?
unfortunately.
Oh, Remembrance.
Remembrance,
Yeah, not
our
sold on that
favorite
card.
card.
But Rain Razors and Art of War are both very powerful cards, and feel like they could easily be reds and still see pretty close to the same amount of play, maybe slightly less, but they are yellow no blocks that are very, very powerful. And I'm honestly not sure why they're yellow. I think Blood Rush Bellow is also in that camp of I'm not exactly sure why it's a yellow. And then Codex of Frailty definitely falls in that camp where I'm not sure why some of these cards are designed as yellows instead of reds.
Well,
Because
I think it's just to like push their power level up a little bit higher. Like they don't want to be blues because then there's just like too many resources, but you don't want to be reds because then like I think it's like an interesting middle ground lever that they can use to like hedge some of these cards. And I think that's kind of what the design space is kind of supposed to be for yellows, I guess, in like the grand scheme for constructed. Like in limited, they're just kind of like there to balance out limited formats. But for like constructed, I think yellows kind of provide this interesting middle ground for power level balancing.
yeah, that's fair. I guess they're just like they could be reds, but they want these cards to be a little bit better, so they end up as yellows. And
Right. Yeah.
these cards typically end up as some of the best cards in the decks that they're played in. And I guess that's why I'm kind of like they could be reds, but the fact that they're yellows is just like they want these cards to be good. They want these cards to be very good. And Rain Razors and Art of War are both like kind of situational cards where you need a you need at least 3 cards to really like get a good amount of value out of them. Sometimes 4, sometimes 5, depending on the situation. Similar to Blood Rush Bellow, you need 3 cards to do it. You need a resource card, the Blood Rush Bellow, and the card you're discarding. So at least 3 cards for it to be good. And I guess that makes sense for you don't want your reds to be cards that require a full hand to do anything. Though Revel and Runeblood, again, a card that we praise as like being one of the best designed cards, is a red in that same spot.
Yeah. And then I guess to bring the conversation like all the way back to the top, then like, do you think designing cards like Revel or Lost in Thought or even Warmonger's Diplomacy at this spot, do you think it's allowing players who are worse than their opponents to win more games? Because that's the ultimate goal here, right? Is they want more games of Flesh and Blood to be less decided strictly by who's the better player and kind of allow worse players to win, not all the time, not consistently, but not 0% of the time either. Do you think these cards are filling that role? Because I would also argue no. It's close, but I would still say no.
I don't know for Lost in Thought. I'm not sure. I think there is definitely an argument that Warmongers could be doing that, but that's just because of the sheer power level of the card. And like some spots, it's going to be worth like 15 points of value, and that's insane. Your opponent has a 5-card hand, you play Warmongers Diplomacy, and they can't use their hand. That's
Are
um,
you? Would you ever, now that Warmonger's Diplomacy exists, what would it take for you to play a deck that gets hosed by Warmonger's Diplomacy? How high would the ceiling on that deck have to be?
that to be really high.
That's what I'm
I
saying. So the
put
good
both.
players won't play the decks that are hosed by Warmonger's Diplomacy.
That's fair. And it just leads to being a pain point for players that are playing decks that are hosed to. I guess Lexi is a deck that I would play that gets hosed by Warmonger's Diplomacy. I think Lexi is still quite good, and but I feel kind of silly that I put both Azalea and Viscerai in A tier on my tier list, because when I was making this tier list, I wasn't realizing the impact of Warmonger's Diplomacy on the metagame and like decks that are bad against Warmonger's Diplomacy. I don't think I think your deck has to be so much better than the other decks when they don't play Warmonger's Diplomacy to warrant me registering a deck that is that bad to Warmonger's Diplomacy. So I think both Azalea and Viscerai should probably be B tier, maybe C tier.
Yeah. And so there's the element of the good players just won't play the decks that get hosed by like these higher variance cards. And so when you're talking about like a punishing variance card, but when you're talking about like a card like Revel and Runeblood, like sometimes your opponent will just combo off or deal a bunch of arcane damage with the Revel and Runebloods, and you're playing Oldheim still, and you're just like, well, I couldn't prevent that much arcane damage. They presented a proactive game plan that is not consistently that high of a ceiling, but was so high of a ceiling that my consistent game plan wasn't able to deal with it, and I lost. And that speaks more to also why I like cards that when they're good, they are doing something very proactively powerful. And I think there's a lot of design space that can be done with proactively powerful high variance cards without even including things like dice rolling. And, I think something that could, even if we want to talk about cards like Nimbleism and Nimble Strike. We saw Yonji playing Nimble Strike recently in Briar, and you could argue that Nimble Strike's like it's a lower end of variance, but it is still a card with variance built into it, because sometimes you'll draw your Nimble Strikes before your Nimbleisms in your deck, and well, now I just have this really bad attack red block 2, and it's like, oh, this isn't great. But when you've already played your Nimbleisms, it's a pretty good card. Like it's a 1 for 5 go again after you've played your Nimbleism. So designs like that where they're contingent on what order, even what you're drawing your cards in, I think is also a healthier way to like design variants. And you can even argue cards like Codex of Frailty as like a variance card in that regard too, because if you draw it in your first couple hands of the game and you don't have any good attacks to get through, you just have a yellow 2 block.
Yeah, I
it's
think
it's not great, but
I think most of the time, if you don't have any attacks in your first couple hands of the game, any good attacks in your first couple hands of the game, most decks are
you're in a
probably
bad
just
spot
gonna,
anyway.
yeah, you're probably losing whether Codex of Frailty is Codex of Frailty or some other random card. But I do think speaking of Briar, another like high variance card in Briar is Channel Mount Heroic. Sometimes you play Channel Mount Heroic and you attack with 3 go again attacks, and it's worth 9 points of damage on that first turn you play because you pitch a blue earth card and you play 3 attacks. Boom. Um, Force nature especially combines with Channel Mount Heroic to create some of the highest ceiling turns in the game. We saw at Worlds in the semifinals when Dan Rakowski played against Chris Yali. Chris Yali went Channel Mount Heroic, Force Nature, and presented like 40 damage in a turn or something. And like that's like obviously that's not consistent. That's like a very high variance thing. But like I don't think Briar ever felt unhealthy for like well, I guess before the bans and erratas, but like the Channel Mount Heroic builds of Briar never felt like problematically unhealthy. We saw Matt Folks win the Pro Tour 2 with the kind of Tome of the Arknight, Channel Mount Heroic, Belittle Minnowism, Briar deck. And that deck was one of the highest variance versions of Briar that we'd seen with specifically casting these Tome of Harvest a lot. Or not Tome of Harvest, Tome of the Arknight. And it was a higher variance of Briar, but that felt fine. It felt healthy, and worse or players could pick up that deck and get wins with it by kind of rolling well, getting lucky. And if I don't know, I guess I think that doesn't feel like bad variance where you're like building your deck to maximize these Tome of the Arknight, you're building your deck to maximize Channel Mount Heroic, and it is high variance whether you draw it with an Earth Blue, whether you draw a bunch of Earth Blues in spots where they're bad because you're putting all these bad cards in your deck to facilitate running Channel Mount Heroic. And there's costs. Channel Mount Heroic sometimes isn't great. Sometimes you only get 6 points of value out of it, even though you played it and got to keep it around for a turn. It's well, you only get 6 points of value out of it. And when you're warping your deck to include this card, that you're warping your deck to include this card and build around this card, and it's a high variance card where sometimes like the ceiling of it's extremely high and the floor is extremely low, is good. I think that's a good spot for the game to be in. But yeah, go ahead.
And then my last kind of variance, then you kind of already touched on this too now with the Channel Mount Heroic, are basically effects that are your face up basically, or even like heaving a pulverize, like this things you can do on your turn that are going to threaten a lot of good value on your next turn. They don't stick around for forever. I'm not talking about cards like Energy Potion or things like that, because those are very low variance cards because they're going to stick around forever. You get to use them to maximize their potential, like Amulet of Ice. But I guess like Hypothermia, not an Icelander, even could have been this type of like low variance card or high variance card that will sometimes do a thing. I guess no, because it's punishing negatively. So when I'm thinking of the cards of like Channel Mount Heroic, there's also like the blessing cycles that they did in Dynasty. There's all those guardian things like Towering Titan and things like that. These things where you're like, my next turn is going to be insane. I'm giving you one turn cycle. Disrupt me, make me interact with you in some meaningful way. If not, I'm going to get this carried over accrued value to do something very powerful. And I think that creates really interesting and dynamic game states where your opponent's like, oh, how can I swing this like Command and Conquer in a turn where I might not have wanted to swing this Command and Conquer now? Or like, can I play some kind of effect or get you to interact with me to mitigate this high disaster? One aspect of variance on that card. Two, you play this card and you're like, oh, I'm going to do my very powerful thing next turn. You draw your hand and it's 4 reds and you can't do anything with it.
He polarized, draw 4 reds is the worst feeling in the
world. So like, and even something like Blessing of Deliverance, right? Like sometimes that card draws you the card, replaces itself, gains you 3 life. And like, I think playing to these one turn effects on the board, face up value kind of things are really, really interesting. And I think really underexplored in Flesh and Blood overall.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think like they're very cautious about printing things that like preserve power for later. Like Energy Potion is probably the strongest. And then we have Time Snap
Potion. Yeah.
But like, I think these effects that are like, I'm going to be really strong next turn and I have to use it next turn. They've been more cautious about these than I think maybe they need to with like cards like the whole Blessing cycle. I think all of them are quite bad. They're 1 cost. They don't have Go Again, and they are what you would expect for a 0 cost with Go Again a lot of the time. So that's what the effect is. I guess they block for 3, so they've got that going for them. But They are what they are about as powerful as you'd expect a zero cost non attack action with Go again to be. So it's kind of weird to see them because it's not like flexible power. It's this next turn I'm doing it. So
Yeah, and maybe like they think like, well, if you just pitch stack it and you set it up for a second cycle, then it's not then it's not high variance anymore. You know you're going to draw the perfect card to go with your blessing of savagery or whatever. But it's like these decks that are doing that aren't necessarily trying to get to the second cycle. Like that's just not a very common play pattern for a deck that would want to be playing these types of effects. One and two, they're still not even like good enough rate to make doing something like that worth it. And I'm not saying like they should print cards to make it worth it. Like there's so much wiggle room to put like a card that's like, well, my next attack, as long as I draw, a lightning, an earth, and an ice card in my next hand, I'm gonna, get +2 and dominate or whatever.
and Go again.
Like this whole Starvo effect. Like Starvo was a pretty high variance hero. But like, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point.
Yeah, I think we're both just kind of rambling a little bit. So
We're getting late in the cast. I'm losing my focus. I need blessing of focus. Is that's one of the blessings, right?
I think that's
the ranger one. I think. Yeah, blessing of focus is the ranger one.
Okay. So I guess we talked about some of the low variance decks. Like we talked about the Guardians, we talked about Icelander a little bit. Talked a little bit about Briar being kind of high variance. I think Viserai also falls in this category of higher variance where you draw your Rebel at the right times. You draw very powerful Mortar Tide turns, or sometimes you just draw a clunk of attack actions or a clunk of reds. I guess everyone kind of has that fail state of drawing all reds or all blues when they need to pitch things to play cards, but Runeblades have an additional level where they need to draw a reasonable mix of attacks and non-attacks.
Yeah, and Azalea has that too. Any decks that are kind of playing like these split types of cards are usually kind of vulnerable to that kind of effect.
Yeah, so I guess like comparing ninjas to Runeblades, I think ninjas are generally lower variance than Runeblades because they don't have a whole extra card type that matters. They're just drawing attacks, and most of their attacks function well together. Fi was the first time we really saw this because I think Katsu's like kind of more Runebladey, where you had like starters and non-starters in the old versions of Katsu before like they printed Descendant Gust Wave that's both a starter and non-starter, and then we saw Spinning Wheel Kick that's kind of both a starter and a combo card. So Katsu kind of ended up or started as more of a higher variance hero, but kind of the design of those Outsiders cards kind of shifted him away from that.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, Fi was definitely a lower variance hero too, especially when you had the stubby hammers and just belittle minnowism and things like that, like where he was just able to consistently produce, because then at that point all you care about is just drawing attacks with Go again, and it's like it's really easy to draw
more than half the deck.
Yeah, it's really
like
easy to draw a bunch of
Icelander.
yeah, like it's just like the deck building requirements are so low to get that power level. Like sure, you're a low variance crazy powerful hero, good job.
Yeah, I think belittle specifically is an interesting card because it's like intrinsically a high variance card where like if you draw it, it's a red 2 block that you need to draw with specific cards, but it has like the interesting deck building things of like I want to put a bunch of three or lower power attacks in my deck. And I think the biggest reason that belittle eventually ate the axe is they made so many good little attacks, and it makes sense. They're just going to keep putting attacks. A lot of them are going to have 3 or less power and be quite good.
Yeah. So I think we were discussing this a little bit, and I'll bring this up as the final point. So the heroes that have living legend up to this point, I think Prism is a very low variance consistent deck that's able to drag games out and just get a bunch of accrued value through her spectral auras.
Yeah, I guess touching on Prism, I think part of her low variance is most of her cards are yellows in a deck that wants to pitch yellows and play yellows. So like it's similar to Icelander where your deck is so heavily blue where most of the time you're pitching and playing blues. Prism has the same thing with yellows where almost all of your cards are yellows, like more than half the deck, and almost every Prism deck was yellows. And when all of your cards are both resource cards and cards you want to play, that gets rid of a lot of that variance of drawing an awkward clump together.
Yeah. I would say Starvo looks like a high variance hero. And I think the first impression by everybody was like, this hero is like, okay, like he's just too high variance, like whatever. But like, I think he wound up being way more consistent and way more powerful than LSS intended to. And I think that's also why he living, because his ability was so good, even with that like mid-range variance. Like I think if he was a higher variance hero with that same ability, then like he's fine. But given that he has some level of variance into him, sorry, given that he has like just a moderate level of variance, but that's still crazy powerful ability. I don't think there was enough variance baked into his design to mitigate his upside, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I would have preferred if there's like the ceiling of his power level was a little bit lower rather than increasing the variance. I think he was like a solidly high variance hero, especially in first cycle. Like a lot of your games were over in first cycle, and first cycle was pretty high variance. Especially also after they banned Autumn's Touch and you got rid of all those 3 blocks, it made him even higher
Sure, yeah.
variance because now instead of being able to block for 9 and swing hammer on a lot of your hands that miss Starvo trigger, um, now you were blocking for 8 because all your Autumn's Touches were replaced with 2 blocks.
And then I think Chain is also an insanely low variance hero. I think good players were consistently able to navigate him to the same kind of end game states where he just kind of set up the same kind of attack non attack ratio to present insane amounts of damage. And you kind of look at him and you're like, well, it's going to be pretty high variance, right? Because you don't know what you're banishing off the top, but you do when you start pitch stacking, and then you're like, well, let me count. Oh, I've played 4 cards. I know that I pitched this, so I know in this turn cycle I'm going to hit this card, and this is going to be my pitch. And like people, the good players started like figuring out how to completely like nullify any variance with like the soul shack. Well, I shouldn't say any, but like the vast majority of variance in a chain, and just navigate it to like these beautifully, perfectly planned out end game states. Like,
I,
do you agree with that?
I don't agree with what you're saying that like a lot of the chains can navigate to good end states, but I think chain is very high variance. You can definitely miss on your shackles, and a lot of the time, even if you set up this perfect second cycle, um, if you're not doing anything first cycle because your banishes are all bad, then they can just like pressure you to threaten to kill you before you get there, or you just don't leak enough damage that even your perfectly pitched stack second cycle, if your opponent's at 36 life and you're like, all right, here it is, it's my final turn, I'm going to do 40 damage, and they just block 12 and you do 28, and then you've got nothing left. That's not good enough, you know. So I think Chain is reasonably high variance. I think his power level was so high above basically everything else that was around while he was that like it's like, yeah, your high variance where your floor is reasonably like about on par with the other best aggro decks, and your ceiling is way higher, so it didn't feel as high variance as it actually was.
That's fair. I'll defer to you on chain, but I guess from my impression and watching a lot of chain, I admittedly didn't play the most amount of chain, so I guess I didn't experience it firsthand. But I just thought, especially watching like Pablo win the Pro Tour, it felt like he was able to kind of consistently get kind of like the game states he was planning for out of his deck.
Yeah, I would.
But maybe that was just a bunch of good variants.
I think part of it is variance. There's a lot you can do as a good player to mitigate variance in chain, but I don't think that makes the hero any lower variance. And like, I think that
Anyone else?
yeah, I don't think he's lower variance than like most of the other heroes in the game. I think he's might be lower variance than like some of the other very high variance decks. Like he's probably lower variance in a deck that's rolling Scabskins every turn, but he's still pretty high variance.
Yeah. And a final thing, I guess we never have to talk about Chain again because he's dead. So much for a good balanced living legend format. That was a fun theory while it lasted.
um, yeah,
Warmonger's Diplomacy wrecks Chain.
Yeah. Now, if you look at a Prism deck trying to fatigue Chain, you get your 3 Arclight Sentinels, you get your 3 Warmongers Diplomacies, and it's going to be really hard for Chain to get through a Fatigue Prism now. Starvo can also just slot 3 Warmongers Diplomacies, fatigue the Chains. Everyone's going to be like that. That card is so hard to beat as Chain, and like there were other cards that were quite potent against him, like playing a Channel Lake Frigid near the end of his pitch stack, very strong. Takes 2 cards and he can play through it. Playing Arclight Sentinel near the end of his pitch stack, also very strong, but he could play through it with Lead the Charge or Time Snap Potions. Like he had outs to these. Warmonger's Diplomacy, there's not really an out to. You can't activate your hero power. You can't use Spellbound Creepers to play non-attack action because you're not allowed to play non-attack actions. You're just going to play one attack.
You can play Art of War. That's it.
Oh, you can play Art of War. Shadowverser, you can also play with banishing a card to get go again, but it's very hard to do a lot of things through Warmonger's Diplomacy.
Yeah, for sure. So hopefully, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it was secretly broken with all these other new cards, I guess, too. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's also possible that Chain is now not great in Living Legend format. Eventually, the meta moves away from playing 3 Warmonger's Diplomacy. If Chain's the only deck that it's good against, you don't want it against Prism. You don't want it against the Guardians. So if Chain's the only deck that's good against, and Chain becomes unplayable because of it, eventually people will get to the point where, is it really worth slotting in these blue block 3s that have like very low downside to include in my deck, but like there's slightly better blue block 3s I can play in other matchups? Maybe you get to that point. That's the problem with making this card a blue block 3.
Yeah, I was about to say, that's like a really easy, like just slide 3 of those bad boys in your deck and you're just like, it's fine.
Red block 2?
I think Chain would probably have a...
If it's a red block 2, it's
block
only a
completely
different
card. Thing. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well. Any final thoughts, buddy?
I guess we said a lot about Variance and Flesh of Blood. I think that making a card game really hard. There's a lot of things to think about. I've done a great job with LSS in general. Has done a great job with most of the cards. I think they missed the marks on a few of them.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great job with your new job, Roger. I wish you kept more Mario's Diplomacy a little bit. Like
that one wasn't me. That was somebody else put that in the final, and I didn't see it.
Yeah. But everything else they've done right is you. All right, thank you very much for
all the good decisions. All me.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see a Warmonger's Diplomacy ban at some point in the card's life. I think it is going to keep hosing random heroes, and it being a blue block 3, it's hard to see a world where this card goes away otherwise. And when your blue block 3 is hosing people, they aren't devoting sideboard slots. It's just a blue block 3 they just throw in their deck because it's a blue that blocks for 3. Or they just design enough space around it that it's meaningless anyways with instants, because it's just like if Azalea has like Rain Razors, there's another instant ranger effect that gets printed that buffs arrows or something like that. If she could play Lightning Press, if you could just mitigate it with instants, then like that could also just completely make the card irrelevant as well. So it's either you push this other design space of a completely different like card type to make it irrelevant, or you have to deal with it in some other way. I don't know. It's just a weird card. Yeah, it's hard because like no matter how many other good cards you put of other card types, like making non-attack actions not a card type you want to include in your deck is really, really tough. So, and especially like there's a lot of cool red 2-block non-attack actions. We talked about Revel and Runeblood. This is not a card I ever want in my deck if Warmonger's Diplomacy is a big part of the format.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, the next time you're losing to Variance, always remember, mind your manners.